before the world rebuilt its cities, before the smoke of war had cleared from Europe's ruins, one nation sat at the center of a quiet transformation that would decide the next century. Its factories were untouched, its vaults overflowing with gold, and its currency, the American dollar, would soon become something far greater than money. It would become a passport to survival. In 1944, deep in the mountains of New Hampshire, representatives from 44 countries gathered at a place called Bretton Woods. The goal was simple on paper: rebuild a shattered world economy. But beneath the polished speeches and diplomatic smiles, a new financial architecture was being written, one that placed the United States at its very core. Every nation agreed that from that day forward, the value of their currencies would be linked to the U.S., and the dollar itself would be tied to gold. At $35 an ounce, it sounded fair, logical, and stable. America, after all, owned nearly 3/4 of the world's gold reserves. Its promise carried weight, both literally and symbolically. For the rest of the world, this was a deal born out of exhaustion. Europe lay in rubble. Japan was burned to ashes, their factories silent, their treasuries empty. America, by contrast, was booming, producing half of the planet's industrial output. The dollar wasn't just strong, it was irresistible. And so the foundations of a silent empire were laid. No territory was conquered, no borders redrawn. Yet every nation, willingly or not, placed its financial heartbeat inside the American system. They didn't surrender to soldiers, they surrendered to spreadsheets. Ships began to cross the Atlantic again, loaded with steel, machinery, and food, all priced in dollars. Banks rebuilt their reserves in dollars. Central bankers converted gold into paper certificates bearing the seal of the United States Treasury. And slowly, the world's wealth began orbiting a single symbol, a green note with a familiar face. At first, it was a partnership. The world trusted the dollar because it was backed by something real, gold stored in Fort Knox and New York's Federal Reserve. But trust, like power, tends to shift when no one is watching. The arrangement gave America an advantage no empire had ever enjoyed before: the ability to pay for global influence with its own currency. Instead of shipping gold across oceans, it could simply print value, and the world would accept it. Every road, every trade route, every shipment of oil quietly reinforced the same pattern. To do business, you needed dollars. And to get dollars, you needed America. It was controlled without conquest, a map redrawn not by armies but by contracts. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, this system appeared unbreakable. The Marshall Plan poured billions into Europe, dollars that rebuilt cities and factories, but also tied them to American markets. Across Asia, similar programs followed. Nations recovered, but each recovery was linked to Washington's currency and credit. The global economy was reborn, but it was reborn inside the dollar's shadow. By the 1960s, small cracks began to appear. Some countries noticed that America was printing more dollars than it had gold to support. The math is no longer balanced. But by then, the dollar had already become too essential to question. Gold was the promise, yet faith was the reality. Traders, bankers, and governments continued using it, not because they believed in the metal behind it, but because they believed everyone else would. And that belief, multiplied across continents, was stronger than any army. For the first time in history, one nation could expand its wealth simply by expanding its debt. The rest of the world financed its ambitions, bought its exports, and stored its currency as their own savings. America had built an empire where tribute came not in gold or crops, but in confidence. No soldiers needed to guard this empire. The guard was the system itself. The agreements, the banks, the balance sheets, all maintained a global illusion of order. Nations didn't fear invasion, they feared exclusion. By the end of the 1960s, that illusion would face its greatest test. The world had begun to suspect what America already knew, that the gold in its vaults could no longer match the promises printed on its notes. The empire of faith was growing heavier than the metal beneath it, and so in August of 1971, the world would wake up to find that the foundation of its trust, the gold standard itself, had quietly vanished. But that story would not begin with gold, it would begin with power. The illusion of gold had finally cracked. By the early 1970s, the United States was spending more than ever on wars abroad, on programs at home, on a lifestyle the rest of the world quietly financed. Dollars flowed outward faster than gold could return. Nations began to question whether America still had enough metal to honor its promise. They were right to wonder. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a televised announcement that would rewrite modern economics. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. Temporarily, he said, but that temporary pause became permanent. From that night forward, money was no longer a claim on something tangible. It was a claim on trust itself. The Bretton Woods order collapsed overnight. Yet rather than fall into chaos, a new structure formed, one that served American interests even more perfectly than the old. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, it needed to be backed by something everyone on Earth would still need. That something was oil. In 1974, U.S. officials met quietly with the House of Saud. The agreement was simple but seismic. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, and in exchange, America would guarantee its protection. Other OPEC members followed. From that point onward, any country wanting energy had to first obtain dollars by trading, exporting, or borrowing from U.S. banks. It was elegant, it was invisible, and it was total. Every barrel of oil pumped from the desert meant fresh global demand for U.S. currency. Nations built reserves in dollars, not just for stability, but for survival. The petrodollar became the bloodstream of world commerce. America could now print the very currency other nations needed to purchase the most vital resource on Earth. The weaponization of the dollar had begun. Not through confrontation, but through convenience. What started as a system of trust evolved into a system of dependency. The U.S. no longer needed to conquer markets. It simply made itself unavoidable. By the 1980s, financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank expanded this reach. Loans to developing countries came with conditions. Open your markets, privatize your industries, peg your currency to the dollar. For struggling economies, refusal meant isolation. Acceptance meant indebtedness. Either way, Washington's influence grew. Every crisis that followed strengthened the dollar further. When Asia collapsed in 1997, investors ran to the safety of U.S. assets. When Europe trembled during its debt storm, the dollar rose again. Even disasters abroad became fuel for its supremacy. In every downturn, people sought the same refuge, the currency of the very nation that often caused the storm. And when diplomacy failed, finance carried the same weight as force. Sanctions froze nations in place. Banking networks like SWIFT could cut entire governments out of global trade with a single code. An enemy without access to dollars could not pay for oil, food, or medicine. The effect was the same as siege warfare: slow, silent, devastating. This was power in its purest modern form, the ability to decide who participates in the world economy and who waits outside the gates. The battlefield had moved from land and sea to balance sheets and databases. A fleet could take months to reach an enemy's shore, but a financial command could strike in seconds. Where armies once carried flags, banks now carried compliance forms. Where borders once stopped soldiers, regulations now stopped transactions. And through it all, the printing press never slept. Trillions of new dollars circulated globally, financing wars, markets, and consumer dreams. Yet inflation, the quiet echo of excess, was exported outward. Foreign nations held those dollars as reserves. Their citizens absorbed the cost. The empire taxed the world without collecting a single coin. Every note, every digital transaction, every international loan reinforced the same hierarchy. The United States issues, the world uses. That simple arrangement allowed America to live perpetually beyond its means, borrowing in a currency it alone could create. By the early 2000s, the dollar was no longer just a currency. It was infrastructure. It was diplomacy. It was enforcement. And every technological advancement, credit cards, wire transfers, online banking, only deepened that dependence. The paradox was complete: a world more connected than ever, yet more centralized than ever, all revolving around the financial gravity of one nation. Empires of the past had to expand territory. This one expanded compliance. Its strength was not measured in missiles, but in spreadsheets that spanned continents. The true genius of the system lay in its invisibility. Most people never noticed the weapon at all. They saw only convenience, faster payments, stable prices, global trade. But beneath that convenience lay a single truth: the power to control money is the power to control behavior. A government cut from dollars cannot import fuel. A company denied access to banking cannot exist. A population cut off from markets cannot breathe economically. And so the empire endured, not by force, but by function. Each new sanction, each trade agreement, each bailout tightened the web. What began as trust had evolved into dependence, and dependence into leverage. The Bretton Woods dream of cooperation had quietly transformed into a global operating system owned by one issuer. The dollar had become the world's default language, and America held the dictionary. But control built on faith is fragile. Faith can fade, and networks can fracture. As other nations watched the weapon at work, they began to build shields of their own: alternative payment routes, regional currencies, digital ledgers, small cracks forming in a once unbreakable wall. The war had entered a new phase. Still silent, still bloodless, but now, the empire's targets were learning to fight back. The world still runs on the same invisible current that began in the ashes of the last great war. But the tide is changing. The dollar remains the backbone of global trade. Yet the hands that hold it have started to tremble. Every nation today measures its strength not just in armies or industry, but in how many US dollars it can access. Over 80% of international transactions still flow through that single channel. Even the smallest deal, a barrel of oil, a ton of wheat, a shipment of microchips, passes through the same gate, and that gate is guarded by America. For decades, this system felt unshakable. But in recent years, the quiet obedience that once defined the global order has started to fray. New alliances have emerged, built not on ideology, but on exhaustion. China, Russia, India, Brazil, and other regional powers have begun to design their own payment systems. Small, fragmented, experimental, their goal is simple: to trade without asking for permission. The effort is slow, but it is relentless. Deals in local currencies, digital payment platforms, gold settlements, all tiny cracks in a wall once thought indestructible. For the first time in 70 years, the dollar faces competition not from a single rival, but from the collective fatigue of an entire world. Every financial sanction, every frozen account, every country cut off from trade has taught the same lesson: what America can do to its enemies today, it could one day do to anyone. That realization has turned allies cautious and adversaries strategic. Dependence, once seen as safety, is now seen as risk. Still, the dollar endures, because old habits die slowly, and trust dies even slower. The systems built around it are too vast to unwind overnight. The world may resent American dominance, but it cannot yet replace it. Banks, markets, and central reserves still orbit the same gravitational pull, even as they search for escape velocity. But the cost of maintaining this supremacy is rising. Endless deficits, growing debt, and inflation now erode the very credibility that once defined the dollar's strength. The empire built on faith now demands ever more faith to survive. Each new crisis is met with the same response: more credit, more currency, more belief. And belief, history reminds us, is the most fragile foundation of all. For the ordinary citizen, this war is invisible but personal. The price of food, rent, and energy is shaped not only by markets, but by the hidden tides of currency politics. A decision made in Washington ripples through every store and household across the planet. When a superpower prints relief, another country pays in inflation. When a nation resists, it risks economic isolation. No missiles are launched, no headlines declare battle, but every transaction is part of the same global contest for control. The weaponized dollar has drawn no blood, yet it bleeds through every budget, every debt, every silent compromise nations make to stay within its reach. Still, for all its reach, even this empire cannot escape the gravity of history. Every system that centralizes power eventually meets the limits of its own success. Others begin to imitate, innovate, and challenge. Gold was once unshakable, so was the British pound. And now, even the dollar, the most powerful symbol of modern civilization, feels the quiet breath of change on its back. The world won't collapse overnight. The dollar won't vanish in a day, but its dominance, like every empire before it, will not last forever. What replaces it may not be another currency, but something deeper, a new kind of trust, spread across technologies, nations, and people tired of permissioned prosperity. Until then, the war continues, silent, bloodless, relentless, because in the end, the greatest victories are not won on battlefields. They are printed in plain sight. If you found value in this story, if it helped you see how invisible power shapes the visible world, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. It helps this project reach more curious minds who still believe that knowledge, not noise, should guide the conversation. This was Financial Ripples, where we uncover the waves beneath the surface of money.